Oh, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And I hope you're having a wonderful day. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you happen to be watching on. They will appear here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And today is January 15th. And my subject today is old and new, talking about the good old days. Um, and we'll start that subject in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to take a moment and explain how I decided to discuss this today. Um, Today is Martin Luther King Day, which I consider a very important holiday. I am a very strong believer in equal rights for everyone, and a very strong proponent of civil rights in general. Today is also the 101st birthday of my late father. And hello to Tom. It's good to see you, Tom. Um, and my father was known for many things. One of them was talking a lot about the good old days. And today is also the occasion of a continuing severe winter storm over much of the US. And hello to Christine in the chat room. Here in Danville, it's 2 degrees today, which is a gigantic improvement because yesterday it was -2 degrees. And hello to Pumpkaboo in the chat room. And Pumpkaboo says, greetings and blessings, Rev Don. Once again, I love all your work and I've been following you for probably almost 10 plus years on Magic TV. Thank you, Pumpkaboo. I really appreciate that. Hello to Renee in the chat room. And hello to Shocker Alum in the chat room. Gary from Kansas City. It's good to see you. And Gary says, we're frozen in down here as well. Yesterday was very, very cold. And here in the 100-odd-year-old house I live in, it was very cold. Today, it isn't. I mean, it's a little cold, but it's not affecting the inside of the house quite as much, although we do have all the faucets dripping and so forth. But 2 degrees is way better than -2 degrees. But all of these things together kind of caused me to stop and think about all the things that have changed in life and are changing in life. You know, I often refer to Olivia Robertson, one of the founders of the Fellowship of Isis, who I had the great honor to know. And she often talked about how she hated when people referred to the good old days because she could remember them and they weren't. And then she'd go on about all the things that had improved during her lifetime. And I have to say that that was a very good way of looking at things. And I think that it's appropriate, particularly in times like this, when weather is very inclement, to stop and think about just how much has changed. In some cases, how quickly it has changed, and the difference it makes in our life versus the lives of our ancestors. And, you know, in the Corellian tradition and many, many branches of modern paganism, we venerate our ancestors. And they are very much a part of our contemporary practice. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we would want to necessarily change places with them technologically. Now, there are people who would, and I think in some cases that comes from not really understanding some of the things that have changed. One of the things in my life that I'm very grateful for, have been all through my adult life, is that as a child, we had one set of cousins who were living at least 50 years behind the times. And their house was heated by a wood stove. They did have electricity, but they did not have indoor plumbing. They used an outhouse. They did have a pump in the kitchen, but it was a pump from a well. And because I spent a lot of time there as a child, I got to see what that older life had somewhat been like. And that I've always regarded as a very valuable education. And, it wasn't that bad, but I would not trade central heating for a wood stove for anything. Nor would I trade my comfy heated bathroom downstairs for having to go out in the backyard in this weather to an outhouse. I think that the changes that have happened are very good changes. um, I think that we often are not sufficiently conscious of the good things that have come into our lives. And partly, it is human nature to focus on the problems. And there are certainly problems that are specific to modern life that were not present in the lives of our ancestors, just as there were problems in their lives that we don't have now. But I think we tend to forget the improvements. One of the things I often see talked about online is that people used to age faster. And although that, as a blanket statement, I don't think I can agree with, as a general statement, I absolutely do. I've watched it myself. Um, People do tend to stay a little bit younger looking today longer, though not everyone. I don't think I would count myself as someone who did that, but I look at Lady Crystal, who looked years younger than her age most of her life. I look at other people that I see around today, and yeah, it does seem like people's aging has slowed down a little bit. Now, I realize part of that is viewer prejudice. I think that the fact that when we look at photos of earlier times, the old costumes and hairstyles kind of set our mind to think of these as older people, and also the fact that they're mostly black and white photos does tend to have a harsher effect that makes people look a little bit older. But in my own life as an artist, I can remember back in the 70s really trying to track down what people would normally look like at 40 or 50 or 60 for use in my artworks. And applying what I observed then to what I see today, there are quite a few differences. Not for every person. There are people who age just as fast or faster than they ever did before, but far fewer of them. And why did this change? Um, they're ignoring conspiracy theories, which don't seem to me to hold a lot of weight. Some of the things that changed are really quite obvious if you think about them, and I just talked about them. We have indoor heating and indoor cooling in the summer. Um, Not that long ago, our ancestors were much more at the disposal of the elements. Of course, this caused them to age faster. When you're out in this kind of weather, or when you're in a house that is not that different from being out in the weather, yeah, you're going to age a little faster. People who still live more outdoor lives, I think, tend to age a little faster, unless they're taking preventive steps to stop that, because exposure to the elements is aging. Another thing um, that I think has changed are the beauty products that we use, and the fact that far more people are using them than previously. Um, I think that we are far more cautious about things like hydrating our skin and have products more capable of doing it, which certainly makes us look younger. Um, I notice for myself when I am using different skin creams that it will make a difference in how I appear um, on a regular basis. So I think that's another thing. And one of the biggest things is that we are far, far less exposed to smoke. And, people talk about how smoking was aging, but, I don't think it's just smoking, it's just being around smoke. And everyone was until quite recently, because how were houses heated? Um, Historically, with fire, either wood fire or coal fire. Um, Only very recently did we move past forms of heating that generated smoke right in the house. Uh, Barely over 100 years ago did we move on from wooden stoves. And hello to Steve in the chat room. It's good to see you. Hello to Pagan World TV in the chat room, and and Pumpkaboo says, I am grateful to live during a time and place where people are more accepting of each other and more connected than ever. And I'm grateful for having access to all kinds of education I wouldn't have before. Absolutely. And Christine says, this cold makes me so grateful for heat, shelter, and food. It also brings me closer to nature. I went up to the store to get a heat light for a rooster that found its way to our side of town a couple of years ago. I also got some bird seed and put cat food out for wild cats. Helping wildlife in need is a very magical experience. Absolutely. And hello to Janet in the chat room. And I want to wish Janet a happy birthday. I believe it was yesterday. And I hope you had a beautiful birthday. All of these things are things that we don't think about having changed on a daily basis in our lives, but they have. And they make a very different life for us than our ancestors knew. One of the things I follow all kinds of historical recreationists and historical channels on YouTube and Instagram and so forth, and I love that, but I wouldn't want to live that way. I follow one called Frontier Patriot, um, which is mostly about cooking from about 2 centuries ago. And Justine, the main character, Justine, is cooking over an open fire as people used to do. And it's fascinating to watch this. And, I can see how, as a choice, if you're doing historical recreation or you're camping or whatever, it's great to know how to cook over an open fire. I love my microwave. I love having an actual stove that I don't have um, to rake for coals and build fires in and watch the heat of the fire and keep plugging it as I go. Um, I think that's a huge step forward. I wouldn't want to go back for anything. Um, I think that the skills that allowed cooks in earlier times to cook over open fires were valuable, interesting skills that we mostly don't need and don't maintain today. Um, and at that time, they were very important. Today, they're largely forgotten, except among historical recreationists and others who have a particular need for them. And I don't see that as a loss to society. Um, I think that we have come forward tremendously with things like gas stoves, electric stoves, and whatever the next stove is going to be, things like microwaves and all the other different things we have to cook with now that I rather imagine our great grandparents would have loved to have had in similar times. It is certainly an interesting avocation to recreate history that way. But I don't really see that I would want to live there. One of the channels I follow is Dandy Wellington, who has a saying that I believe originates with him, which is vintage style, not vintage values. And this is, I think, particularly a reference to the racism that was far more prominent in past generations, still unfortunately too prominent today. But it speaks to my attitude toward history, that we take the good forward, the vintage style, for example, but not the bad. And we leave those things where they are. And I believe when we work with our ancestors, we're working with their higher self. That is the part that becomes the ancestor. And through them, we get the good. We don't necessarily get, for example, what prejudices their conscious selves might have had in those lifetimes. That isn't the part that goes forward. That gets left with this life, at least in the way that I practice and the experiences I have had. And I think that we need to, in our own lives, try to be that way as well, to leave the negative behind us and to embrace the positive as we go forward. One of the things Olivia Robertson used to always remark upon when she talked about not liking when people talked about the good old days was that in those days, everyone was riding around in ass carts, meaning donkey-driven carts. Automobiles, well, as she would put it, her family had the only automobile anywhere nearby. where they lived in Ireland. She came from a wealthy aristocratic family, and as she put it in a different conversation, they were the only people there who had any money at that time. Everyone else was struggling very hard to get by. Now, over time, that changed, and she loved that. The time we had that conversation was during the technological renaissance that Ireland was experiencing um, in the early 2000s, where, as she put it, everybody had money. And in fact, her family had tended to lose its money, although not all of it, but everyone else had gained money. And she thought that was a wonderful change in society. I totally agree. I've been enjoying watching snippets from the Gilded Age on YouTube. But, I certainly wouldn't want to live there. And one of the things that I've lately started thinking and mentioning is that it's wonderful to love these historical romances, which are almost always about the upper class. But unless you're in that class today, you have no reason to think you would have been in that class then. And this is not the lifestyle you would have been living. So I think that we need to be mindful of all of the great inventions and innovations our ancestors and our contemporaries have made for us, and how they do impact our lives for the better, both in terms of technology and in terms of social growth. And I've often talked about how there is no universal concept of, quote, good or evil that you can point to through history, because it's constantly changing. And many things that we regard as good today, our ancestors a few generations back might have regarded as absolutely aberrant. Things like equality between the sexes, um, equality between the races. Many of our ancestors vehemently opposed these things and did not consider them good, but we grew as people. And we will continue to grow, even though at times it seems to step backward. We must continue to push forward. We must continue to build a better world. Um, and our ideas of what is good will change as we move forward, and that's only to be expected. Um, and and Tom in the chat room says, "I smoked for 30 years, but not anymore." That's wonderful, Tom. And hello to Raven in the chat room. And Tom said, "Food tasted so much better then." That's an interesting subject I may find myself segueing into. And Pumpkaboo says, "A YouTuber I enjoyed is called Tasting History with Max Miller." Me too. He does videos about historical cooking and discusses both the history around the dish and how to make them. Um, and it's wonderful for kitchen witches. Yes, Max has Tasting History is a wonderful channel, and Max is a very entertaining host. Um, and I love the way that he talks about the history of some of these dishes, some of which are not what you expect them to be. Um, I'm very interested in tasting history. And Janet says, "I'm grateful for blankets and fuzzy socks." Yes, indeed. And thank you for the birthday wishes. Uh, Blessed to be at 60. Yes, indeed. My mother passed away at the age of 55, and I'm ready to see what this new chapter will bring. Congratulations, Janet. May it be a wonderful chapter. Um, when we look at all these things that have changed, I think we cannot really look at our modern lives and think that they are not, in fact, better. Yes, of course, they do bring with them some new problems of their own. But, if we went backward, there'd be old problems we've forgotten that our ancestors were all too well aware of. For example, I mentioned earlier, we have the faucets running here at the house to make sure the pipes don't freeze. When I think of my cousins with the indoor pump for their water, I'm not quite sure what they would have done in this weather. That's a problem they would have faced that I do not, but they certainly would have had to face it. I certainly can imagine the problem of having to go out to that outhouse in 2-degree weather, or even worse, negative 2-degree weather like we had yesterday. I much prefer our modern problems. Um, Now, Tom had mentioned food tasting better years ago. One of the things I've found um, over the years is, for a while, when I would revisit Central Illinois and sometimes some other places, I often found that food I would eat didn't seem to have any taste, especially at restaurants. Usually, not so much homemade food. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on. This is a modern problem. I eventually came to the view that this is a very real phenomenon. I wasn't imagining it. I had other people who would say they were having the same experience, and I think it has to do with some of the techniques we use to preserve food, and preserving them maybe a little longer than they really should be preserved. I remember back in the 80s when irradiation became a major way of preserving food, and people said, no, this won't affect the taste or the quality at all. And I believe in the short term it does not, but I think in the long term it can. And there was a while when I would come home and visit that it seemed like nothing anywhere had any taste. Now, I find that's not the case so much now, so I think that people must have somewhat caught on to this. Hello to Maggie in the chat room. It's good to see you, Maggie. Um, and taking steps to avoid it. But, it's one of the modern problems that we face, but also we find modern answers. Now, what does all of this have to do with metaphysics, you might ask? Because that is, of course, my general topic. And I can't help but notice that a lot of our metaphysical community seems to be very much afraid of technology. Of course, the latest fear is AI. And AI is nothing, at least at this time, but advanced search engines. And it offers a lot of uses for creative and non-creative people alike. I find it useful in many things that I'm doing now. Just the other day, I was shown a program for animation using AI to help the process, which I'm hoping to avail myself of in the future. That is a huge step forward in doing, for example, stop motion animation or any kind of animation. Um, but I see a lot of people are very afraid. And what I think that I would say to that, and I've also watched them be afraid of every other step in my lifetime. I can remember back in the 70s when personal calculators first became a thing, there were people acting like civilization was about to fall because people could use a personal calculator. Today, I think people couldn't imagine giving up their personal calculators. They're on every computer, they're on every phone, and civilization has not fallen. And people have not become idiots because they don't do all their math by hand. Um, there was just a lot of fear of change. I believe that I remember some of that around computers as well. I remember all kinds of different things that have improved our lives that people were afraid of. And part of what I've tried to do in this program is point out all the wonderful things that have been developed that have made our lives easier, that have caused us to age less quickly in many cases, and certainly to live longer. And that, and I'll remind you that many people were either afraid of these things or felt they were unnecessary when they happened. But we wouldn't want to be turning them back. It would be hard not to imagine um, many of the things we have in life today. And I think that will be true of the electronic technologies that are coming in now and in the very near future. Uh, 50 years from now, we won't be able to imagine what people did before, just as it's very hard to imagine life without cell phones now. I lived most of my life without cell phones, or at least a long portion of it. And yet I find myself um, forgetting the nature of that lifestyle because it's become such a part of of my life. And Tom says, look how the internet has changed. Um, um, no, in terms of modems, I'm not quite certain of the word, um, but yes, I remember when everything we did online took a very long time. How hooking up took longer, downloading anything took forever, and look at it now. And Pumpkaboo says, regarding what I was saying about food, I think using cheaper ingredients can also cause this. Well, yeah, and um, and also many manufacturers design their foods to be very good, but not fully satisfying. I have to agree that's true. Um, my mother pointed that out to me many years ago regarding many common soft drinks that while they tasted good, they didn't necessarily satisfy thirst. And often at a fairly high salt content to guarantee they didn't satisfy thirst because, of course, the makers wanted you to drink more. They didn't want to satisfy your thirst, they wanted to increase it. And this is one of the things that we don't always think about. And certainly not always true now, but it was something that some manufacturers certainly do. Jana says, my dad grew up on a farm. He and his siblings used to wrap up the hot bread from breakfast, put it in their coat pocket, and this kept them warm while walking to school in feet of snow. A problem people had then that we don't think of now, and a very good solution to it. And hello to Sared in the chat room. And Sared refers to old movies. And you think, why are they not using cell phones? And, I've had that happen so many times. It first dawned on me, I was watching a film called The Atomic Vampire, which will tell you something about my film tastes. And there's a scene where where one of the heroines is um, unaware the vampire is coming to kill her, and the dashing hero is trying to get there in time to save her. And I kept thinking, why doesn't he just call her and let her know to lock the door? And then I realized, wait a minute, this is 1963. There are no cell phones. um, and I remember that life, but I often forget it. And Maggie says, I'm thinking of getting a landline for telephone. I'm afraid of satellite interruptions. Um, well, the world is in some ways in an unstable place. I don't know that having a landline is necessarily a bad idea, but I'm sure that we will find ways to adjust to whatever happens. Um, but yeah, we do see the order of the world seeming to disintegrate all around us, which of course is part of the turning of the age. To some extent, we'd expect it. Um, but this kind of comes down to the end of our half hour, and again, my point today is that it's wonderful for us to take forward the good of former times. That's the whole point of life. Take the good, go forward with it, but leave the bad and embrace the new. New technologies are going to make everything better. They are going to help us, I believe, to further develop our spirituality, not impede it, but further be tools that we can use. Um, and I think all of this is very positive. And I encourage you to embrace the changes that are coming while holding on to the good of the past. And I think if we do this, we will build a much better world. I see a lot of people desperately trying to hold on to the past and reject the future, and I think they will deeply regret it in the long run. But those are my opinions, and I thank you for joining me, and let us close now with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to take the good of life forward with us and leave the bad behind. Help us to embrace the new things that can make our lives better while holding on to the old things that also make our lives better, and overcoming all of the problems, both old and new, by constantly looking for new solutions. Let us not be passive victims of circumstances, but rather always look to improve them and to build better lives for ourselves and others. And let us also remember that peace is not merely the lack of conflict, but it's a world in which we can all live good lives regardless of who we are. And help us to build that world. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks, knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always.